Well, now we get to go to war again, and we have in World War II the biggest of all. The sheer human costs of World War II are hard to fathom. Estimates of the lives lost in the period from 1939 to 45 range from 35 to 50 million people. That's a lot of people. And it's also a period which includes genocide, one of the worst episodes in modern history, and also advances in weaponry, such as tanks, aircraft, radar, but of course, most dramatically, the invention and only use of the atomic bomb in war. And it was also a war that was marked by a demand different from World War I, which was unconditional surrender. So it was followed by occupation of Germany and Japan and the efforts to remake them as democracies. In that sense, it went beyond the systemic level of changes at the international system and went actually inside the states and changed the natures of the states. And in a sense, you could argue that it solved the German problem for about a half a century, with the answer of how many German-speaking states there'll be from 45 to 90. The answer was 3, if you include Austria. It also ushered in a bipolar world, a world in which the United States and the Soviet Union stood significantly larger than all the other major powers. And that represented the final dwarfing of Europe. Europe, in a sense, then became an arena rather than an actor in international politics. Now, World War II is sometimes called Hitler's War. And it's a lot of truth in that, sobriquet, but it's a little bit too simple. It was more than that. World War II was also unfinished business from World War I. Indeed, some historians say that it was merely part 2 of the Great War that racked Europe, or if you want, Europe's 20th century, 30 Years' War. It certainly was a great deal of continuity between some of the problems of World War II and the problems of World War I. There's also a question of what kind of a war it was. It may be true when we ask whether it was Hitler's war to say yes, but even if Hitler wanted war, World War II wasn't the war he wanted. He wanted something short and snappy, a blitzkrieg. He expected, for example, when he invaded Russia, that it would be a short war. And there's also a little bit too much simplicity in calling it Hitler's war, because that ignores the war in the Pacific. Hitler may have egged Japan to war, but without success. Japan didn't attack Singapore or Russia as Hitler wanted, and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was actually a surprise to the Germans. In that sense, the Pacific War had its own roots, more in the traditional competition for hegemony in the region. Now, some historians have gone so far as to almost exonerate Hitler. A.J.P. Taylor, the famous British historian, in his book, The Origins of the Second World War, which ironically I heard as a student at Oxford when he first gave the lectures on it, sees Hitler as a nasty fellow and an unpleasant adventurer, but basically an opportunist who moved into the vacuum that was created by the appeasement policies of the West. And I think that thesis goes too far in denying it as Hitler's war. If you look at the record, it seems to me there are two major anomalies that Taylor doesn't take adequately into account. One was Hitler's own writings. In Mein Kampf, Hitler sets out his plans. Now, Taylor dismisses that as saying these are the rantings that you get from a right-wing extremist politician who is being influenced by the fact that the French had just sent troops into the Ruhr, and that doesn't really prove a carefully worked out plan. But Hitler's second book in 1928, which he kept secret, repeated and developed the same sorts of plans. The second thing, it seems to me, a piece of evidence that Taylor doesn't take adequately into account is what's called the Hossbach Memorandum, named for Colonel Hossbach, an aide who took notes at a meeting of Hitler and others at Berchtesgaden in 1937, November of 1937, in which Hitler says that we must achieve more space in Europe through the use of force by 1943, or else we'll be finished and obsolete, and we'll take our opportunities in the East when opportunities arise, and Austria and Czechoslovakia will be first. That memo from 1937 is pretty close to what happened. Now, if you look at the situation that Hitler faced, he had four possible policies that Germany could follow. One was passivity, to accept the position that he inherited and learn to live with it. A second was economic growth, to try to prevail in Europe by focusing on internal economic development. A third was to revise the Treaty of Versailles back to the 1914 borders, to recover what Germany had lost in World War I. And the fourth, the one that he chose, was a breakout, a radical middle, if you want, in Europe, in the sense of what we do is first break out on land to east to west, and then you might later think about overseas. But in the first instance, to go east for Lebensraum, or living space. Now, there were four phases to this approach that Hitler took, this grand strategy that he finally decided on. The first phase, from 1933 to 36, would be a phase that you might call clever diplomacy to destroy the Versailles post-war system. He starts with domestic repression, and in October 1933, he withdraws from the Disarmament Conference and from the League of Nations and blames it on the French. Says the French haven't been cooperative enough, that's why we have to get out. In January of 1934, he signs a treaty with Poland, which is an effort to disrupt the French efforts to get alliances on the other side of him. And in March 1935, he denounces the clauses in the Treaty of Versailles which restrict Germany's army, so that the army, which was restricted to 100,000, he then can quintuple to 500,000 and begin the building of an air force. And at the same time, he opens naval talks with the British, so that he can begin to divert, again, and say, well, he may not be doing so bad, we may still be able to work with him, and that by dissolve any Western unity against him. In March of 1936, he marches troops into the demilitarized Rhineland area, which he speeds up because the others are diverted with the Ethiopian events. And then he accuses the French of destroying the Locarno Treaty by trying to reach a pact with the Soviet Union. But he also hints that maybe he'll come back to the League of Nations after enough reforms are made. In other words, this may be a man that you can work with. Basically, a very clever diplomacy playing on the internal inconsistencies of Western opinion. The second phase, from 1936 to 1940, is the phase of expansion against small neighbors. In 1936, he develops a 4-year economic plan for military growth, which is to prepare for war by 1940, though, of course, he keeps this secret. He signs the Axis Pact with Italy and the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, and intervenes in Spain, arguing that he's protecting the West against Bolshevism by coming into the Spanish Civil War on the side of Franco. And in 1938, he moves against Austria with the Anschluss with Austria, when looks like the Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg may have a plebiscite of his own. Hitler preempts him, moves in, and calls his own plebiscite. He then turns to pressure on Czechoslovakia. In the Sudetenland, the mountainous border of Czechoslovakia and Germany, are a number of German-speaking citizens, and Hitler claims that they have to be returned to Germany. Ironically, that's also in the Carpathian Mountains, the area where Czechoslovakia has its best defenses against any German attack. In May of 1938, the Czech government mobilizes its forces. That infuriates Hitler. He vows he will crush Czechoslovakia. But the British become very worried. And under Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, you have 3 different trips to Germany. First to Berchtesgaden, then to Godesberg, and then the infamous trip to Munich toward the end of the year. The British feel that they can't defend Czechoslovakia despite the doctrine of collective security, that it's not worth a war, and they're not ready for war. And so at Munich, they agree to partition the Czechs to give the Sudetenland and the Czech defenses to the Germans without the Czechs even being consulted. Chamberlain flies home and claims that he has saved Czechoslovakia and has achieved, in the immortal phrase, peace in our time. By March of 1939, Hitler sends German troops into Prague and what remains of Czechoslovakia. Britain now finally sees that the illusions of the earlier years have been false and responds by issuing a guarantee to Poland. Hitler begins to stir up trouble in Danzig, the German-speaking area in northern Poland, and in August of 1939 signs his infamous pact with Stalin. Then in September, of course, you have the war, where the attack on Poland, the partition of Poland with the Soviet Union, and it's interesting to recall that at that time, Hitler no longer wanted a Munich. As he is quoted as saying at the time, "I'm only afraid that at the last moment some swine or other will submit to me a plan for mediation." By this time, he wants to have his little war for the glory of fascism. So that ends Phase 2. Phase 3 is really 1940, in which he accomplishes the military mastery of Europe through his attacks on France and Britain. Hitler expects that Britain will quit. After the war first starts in 1939, there's a period of inactivity, which is sometimes called the phony war. But then in the spring of 1940, he preempts by taking quick action in Scandinavia. Then there's the famous Blitzkrieg in France through the Ardennes. The British just managed to evacuate some of their expeditionary force at Dunkirk. And you have Hitler as the master of the European continent, because he still has his pact with the Russians in the east. He controls everything in the west. Franco in Spain is his ally. And essentially he is, through a series of brilliant moves, has moved to a situation where he has control or mastery of Europe, except for Britain. And that brings us to the fourth phase, from 1941 to 45, in which Hitler overreaches and basically brings about his downfall. In the summer of 1940, Hitler planned to attack Russia, but he needed to knock Britain out of the battle first. He felt that if he could get the British to sue for peace, to quit, that would give him a free hand to turn east to Russia. There's the air battle for Britain. The British are successful in fending off the Germans from maintaining or achieving air superiority, therefore they can't invade across the Channel. And Hitler does not take the lesson that this is going to be too difficult. What he decides in June of 1941 is to attack Russia anyway. What he says is that if I have a short victory and quick victory over Russia, and the British feel deprived of any allies, because now the French have been occupied and are out of the game, then the British will have to come to terms with me. And then in December of 1941, after the Japanese attack the Americans at Pearl Harbor, Hitler declares war on the United States. He does this apparently to keep the Japanese locked in the war, and so that he can unleash his U-boat campaign against shipping that's helping Britain. But what he does is essentially unleash World War II as a global war and eventually lead to the end of the German Reich. Now, we can ask, going back to these concepts of images or levels of explanation, what role did the individual, Adolf Hitler, play? How important was he in terms of this set of events? Well, in the first phase that I described, the phase of revising the Versailles Treaty, of trying to get back to where Germany was in 1914, probably any conservative German politician with a strong right-wing majority and a nationalist fervor in Germany might have been able to accomplish the same things. So phase one Hitler did it very cleverly, but it's possible that other German politicians might have done the same thing. Phases 2 and 3, in which he achieves the mastery of Europe, are really tributes to Hitler's skill and the audacity of his particular gambler's approach, also to his bellicose ideology, his desire for war. And phase 4, in which you get to world war and failure, I think also depends very heavily on Hitler's personality. There are two things to notice there. One is Hitler's megalomania. In a sense, his appetite grew with the eating. He became convinced of his own genius. But it also led him into some classic mistakes, such as invading the Soviet Union before he had finished with Britain, which meant that Germany was now locked in a two-front war, rather than just being able to concentrate on one side at a time. And the other was the declaration of war on the United States, which was a godsend for Franklin Roosevelt, who had been getting worried about the situation in Europe, but the American Congress and people were not willing to follow him as far as he wanted to deal with the threat from Hitler. And Hitler's declaration of war, in that sense, gave Roosevelt a perfect excuse to concentrate on restoring the balance in Europe. The other aspect of Hitler's personality that's important is his racist ideology. And that had several effects. One was that when some of the Slavic people, such as the Ukrainians, revolted against the Stalinist system when the German troops swept in, Hitler was not very good at exploiting that as effectively as he might because of his racism towards Slavs, of regarding them as a lesser people. He also misestimated the United States. He looked at the United States through his racist ideology and said it's a country which is full of blacks and Jews. He said Roosevelt has a Jewish ancestor. He can never be an effective leader. And he totally misunderstood that the democracy and sometimes chaotic pluralism of the United States was a strength, not a weakness. And of course, his racist ideology also led him to the expulsion of the Jews, and that, ironically, led to a slower German progress in developing the atomic bomb. So obviously, Hitler mattered. He mattered in terms of what kind of war there was and in its outcome. But it's also true that there were deeper roots to the war and other causes, and that's the value of a iconoclastic book like A.J.P. Taylor's to make us realize that even if he's overstated the point, that there are other causes we need to think about as well. What are those other causes? Well, by now you should realize that we're going to talk about some things that were happening in the international system, as well as things that were happening inside Germany. At the systemic level, at the structural level, there's the point that World War I did not solve the German problem. Bismarck's big indigestible lump in the center of Europe's stomach had not been dissolved by World War I. The Versailles Treaty was both too harsh and too lenient. Harsh enough to stimulate German resentment and nationalism, but too lenient in the sense of not changing the basic capabilities of Germany. And of course, the other structural change or structural cause was the absence of the United States and the Soviet Union as players in the balance of power in the interwar period. There were also process changes in the international system. The revisionist ideology of the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese of wanting to overthrow the status quo, the rise of ideological politics in the major states, and the extreme nationalist, racist ideologies which gave rise to a much less moderate process in the international system. At the level of the second image of what goes on inside countries, there were also important domestic causes. One was the weakness of the democracies. The democracies were cleft by class cleavages. Deep ideological disputes racked Italy in the 20s, France in the 30s, Britain as well. There was also the great economic collapse that accompanied the Depression of the 1930s, which essentially was like pouring gasoline on the fire of these pre-existing class cleavages, which helped to lead to the Nazi takeover in Germany and contributed to the weakness of any effective response in the democracies. And finally, there was the internal United States problems and the policy of isolationism, the unwillingness of the Americans to play a role in the balance of power in Europe. So objectively, the United States should have taken Britain's role essentially as the country which would make sure that no one could dominate the European continent. After all, if the United States had been drawn into Europe in World War I because of the fear that if somebody dominated the continent it would be too much, it should have seen this coming in terms of World War II, but we didn't. U.S. domestic attitudes lagged because of this desire for a return to normalcy, And as the Great Depression deepened, there was an increasing internal preoccupation that deepened isolationism. Franklin Roosevelt, in his second term, began to see the problem in terms of what was going on in Europe, but felt that he was unable to go as quickly as he wanted because of the restraints of American public opinion. So in that sense, that's why Hitler's declaration of war on the United States was, to some extent, a godsend for him. Now, how do these causes fit together? How do we put them together into a sense of the total picture? Well, if you go back to the metaphor of deep and intermediate and precipitating causes, my little example, logs in a fire, logs being deep causes, kindling being intermediate, and the match being the precipitating cause, to some extent, those systemic questions, the failure in World War I to resolve the imbalance in Europe caused by the unification of Germany, those are deep causes at the systemic level. Intermediate causes would be these changes in the domestic politics of the countries, what was happening at the second level. And the precipitating cause would be the personality of Hitler, the way Hitler as a person was able to take risks and gamble in a way that other leaders might not have done. Does that mean that World War II was inevitable? Well, no. By now, you should realize that I never think anything is inevitable in human history, except our own deaths, and that we should think of that term instead as saying, was it increasingly likely as time passes? And that goes back to that metaphor of the funnel, that as time passes, as you go from 1918, where the structural causes mean that there probably might be another war, to 1933, where you have the Nazis coming to power, to 1938, where Hitler begins his strategy and it's not countered, the funnel is increasingly narrowed, but again, not quite inevitable. Then the probabilities start in 1919 when there's a failure to solve the structural problems. But imagine that in the 1920s, there had been appeasement of Germany and preservation of the Weimar Republic. Or imagine that the United States had stayed involved in the balance of power in Europe. There might have been some wars in Europe someday, but not necessarily a World War II of global scale. In the 1930s, you had the shock of the Depression and the strong effects that had on Germany, Japan, and the democracies. But it's not completely clear that that meant you had to have war. It made war more likely. But if Britain and France had confronted Germany, if they had formed an alliance with the Soviet Union at that time, or if the United States had stayed in, perhaps the other German generals and other German conservatives who felt that Hitler was taking too many risks might indeed have overthrown him or not followed him. And in that case, it's possible that you wouldn't have had the large war we call World War II. Since they didn't, then the personality of Hitler became a key precipitating cause. And by late 1937, in the planning of war, I would think that by then it becomes true that war becomes almost inevitable. Now, that tells us something about war in Europe and the onset of war in Europe. But it really doesn't answer the questions of war in the Pacific. All too often we think of World War II with a overly Eurocentric point of view. I think it's proper to understand that the war in the Pacific, that half of World War II, really had largely separate origins. Japan was a more traditional society in which a parliamentary of systems had been grafted on in the 1920s, but which became heavily militarized in the 1930s. And imperial expansion was widely popular in Japan. Japanese nationalism tended to support it, and there were great worries in Japan among the elites about being constrained and excluded, the feeling that Japan as a set of resource-poor islands would be excluded from access to world raw materials. The depression and the cutting of trade in the 1930s made the Japanese feel that they needed to break out to achieve a sphere of influence where they could be clear that they would have access for economic purposes. And that led to this plan for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In other words, a regional hegemony of Japan over Asia. The Japanese worried about the American and the British naval power getting in their way. Their expansion was largely initially at the expense of China, and that led them into diplomatic conflict with the United States. And in 1940, with the fall of France, as Hitler conquered France, the Japanese moved into the French colonies in Indochina, and they were then now expanded in China, in Southeast Asia. And as things looked to them in 1940, they had three major options of where they went next. One was to strike westward against the Soviet Union. And indeed, there were a series of clashes between Japanese and Soviet troops along the border in Manchuria, and that some people felt that there might indeed be a war in that direction. A second option was to move south, to go not just to Southeast Asia, but to the Dutch East Indies, the area we today know as the country of Indonesia, and try to seize the oil of Indonesia, or the Dutch East Indies. And the third option was to strike eastward, where the United States had bases not only in the Philippines, but of course in the Hawaiian Islands. But that one looked too risky. It was further away. It was against an even stronger country. Of the three options, that seemed by far the most risky, and yet that's what they chose. Why? Why did they strike east? Well, for one thing, Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union removed the Soviet threat. The Soviets were now preoccupied with Hitler, and basically the Japanese felt that they could not worry so much about Soviet encroachment on their position in Manchuria, and indeed there was neutrality between Japan and the Soviet Union throughout World War II until Stalin attacked in the final days of the war. The United States was trying to deter the Japanese from moving southward into the areas of the Dutch East Indies. So the United States essentially used an oil embargo against Japan as a way to signal our resolve that we were not going to accept this kind of idea of the Japanese expanding in that direction. As Roosevelt once put it, we'll put a noose around their neck and jerk it from time to time just to remind them that it would be expensive for them to move southward. Dean Acheson is alleged to have said at that period, this can't lead to war because it would be irrational. But Japan, looking at the situation, saw it very differently. They saw the American oil embargo as a cause of eventual defeat without war. 90% of Japanese oil was imported, and even with their stockpiles, Japan felt that their navy could only last one more year if it were a world where there was an oil embargo against them. They were busily involved in negotiations with the United States, in which the United States was continually demanding that they withdraw from China. The Japanese saw this as a situation where their area for economic security, this co-prosperity sphere they were carving out, would be taken away from them. And a number of Japanese felt that it was better to go to war and to suffer in a war than to have a process of slow exhaustion in which you would lose anyway. As Admiral Nagano said to the emperor, it's a little bit like radical surgery. You're not sure you're going to survive it, but it may be the least bad alternative. And in that sense, they had the hope that if Germany defeated Britain, and if the U.S., seeing that they were outnumbered, that events in Europe were difficult, and the U.S. public opinion, which was very isolationist, led for negotiations toward peace, you might be able to attack the United States, and even though the United States was much larger, and not get into a long and difficult war. It's worth quoting the view of the Army Vice Chief of Staff, Sakuda, in his view of what was happening at this period in the Japanese military government. And here's what Sakuda said. In general, the prospects if we go to war are not bright. We all wonder if there isn't some way to proceed peacefully. There is no one who is willing to say, don't worry, even if the war is prolonged, I will assume all responsibility. On the other hand, it is not possible to maintain the status quo. Hence, one unavoidably reaches the conclusion that we must go to war. And thus we had Pearl Harbor. In other words, the idea that deterrence will always work in deterring the weaker state from attacking the stronger state certainly is falsified by this experience of Japan. Japan had to compare not the question of whether it would win, but whether of risking some chance of winning wasn't better than what it saw as sure defeat if it let things go on in the status quo. Now, what are the lessons? Well, the lessons of World War II are often summarized as the dangers of appeasement, or the evils of appeasement. And we're told that the lesson is that we fail to stand up to aggression and succumb to the immoral policy of appeasement. But it's worth keeping a balanced view of the concept of appeasement as to whether it was an immoral policy or not. It's now something of a bad word. The 1930s have been called a low, dishonest decade. But essentially, appeasement is not bad per se. It's a classic tool of diplomacy. In 1815, when the victorious powers who had defeated Napoleon brought France back into the system, that was a successful use of appeasement. In 1900, or the late 1890s and early 1900s, when Britain appeased the rising United States, that was another successful use of appeasement. And indeed, appeasement might have been the right policy toward Germany in the 1920s. The great irony of the interwar period is that the West confronted Germany in the 1920s when it should have appeased her, and appeased Germany in the 1930s when it should have confronted her. And the problem then is always to adjust policy to reality, not to say that this policy is always right or that policy is always wrong. Essentially, it's a little bit like Mark Twain's cat. You know, Mark Twain said that if a cat sits on a hot stove, it'll never sit on a hot stove again, but it won't sit on a cold one either. And in some ways, the dangers that we have on lessons here is to make sure that we can make such distinctions. If we look back at the question of appeasement, certainly Neville Chamberlain had motives which were noble. Chamberlain had lived through World War I. He never wanted to see anything like that again. And here is how Chamberlain saw the situation in 1938, just before going to Munich. And he's speaking about World War I. When I think of those 4 terrible years, and I think of the 7 million of young men who were cut off in their prime, and the 13 million who were maimed and mutilated, the misery and the sufferings of the mothers and fathers, the sons and daughters, the relatives and the friends of those who were killed and the wounded, then I'm bound to say again what I have said before, what I say now, not only to you, but to all the world. In war, whichever side may call itself the victor, there are no winners, but all are losers. It is those thoughts which have made me feel that it was my prime duty to strain every nerve to avoid a repetition of the Great War in Europe. So that was what was driving Chamberlain, but his timing was wrong. In a sense, the problem was not Chamberlain's intentions. Chamberlain's sins were not that he was trying to do the right thing, but the consequences. His failure to appreciate the situation in Europe once Hitler had gotten to the stage he was in 1938. Chamberlain's sins were more ignorance and arrogance than evil intention. Now, in a sense, if you look at World War I and II, they give you 2 quite different models of war. Sometimes World War I is simplified, as we argued, oversimplified as accidental war, and World War II is simplified as planned aggression. But what happens is World War I shows you something of an unwanted spiral of hostility. And in a spiral of hostility where each side is worried about what the other is going to do and overreacts to it, that we saw when we discussed the run-up to World War I, then appeasement may be the best policy. Confidence-building measures, things to appease the other side may help you get out of that spiral. On the other hand, World War II was a failure to deter planned aggression. And there, appeasement doesn't help, but you have to deter and make your deterrence more credible. So in that sense, the kinds of policies that are relevant are very different depending on your assessment of the nature of the intentions of the other side. Now, it's true that in the 1930s, British leaders were trying to do the right thing in avoiding World War I But by trying to avoid World War I, what they did was help to bring on World War II. And it's also true, I believe, that U.S. leaders in the Pacific were trying to deter Japan and thus brought on war. By putting an enemy in a corner where the alternative of peace looks worse than the alternative of losing a war through a gamble, means you will not be able to deter. In that sense, the policies and the situations that were applied in the two areas were at odds with each other. Now, by now, you should also see that these two models of war are still too simple, that World War I wasn't purely accidental, and World War II in the Pacific wasn't carefully planned aggression alone. In that sense, then, perhaps the ultimate lesson is to beware of overly simple historical analogies. When you face the question of whether this is the right response in a particular situation, and are trying to learn the lessons or apply the lessons of the great wars of the 20th century, you have to ask, what are the true facts of history, and how do those facts fit the current reality? The worst thing of all is to take analogies like Munich and apply them to situations like the Vietnam War or Southeast Asia, where it's totally inappropriate and may lead you to a misunderstanding of appropriate policies. So unlike Mark Twain's Once Burned Cat, the real lesson is not to avoid all stoves, but to learn how to distinguish cold stoves from hot ones.